Rajesh Koothrappali is easy to misunderstand. On the surface, he's the shy one. For half of the series, he's the one who can't talk to women. He's the punchline, the butt of the joke. But today I'd like to look beneath the surface, because his is a story of self-image, a struggle with identity. This has been one of the most highly requested videos so far, and I'm glad about that because he is one of my favourite characters, and there's a lot to unpack here, so let's get into it. Raj's inability to speak to women is usually treated as a joke, especially in the first few seasons, but psychologically it looks a lot like selective mutism. Incidentally, in the field that I work in, we now call this situational mutism to better reflect the uncontrollable element of this condition. For anyone who doesn't know, this is a condition where someone is physically able to speak, but psychologically unable to in certain situations. Raj doesn't lack access to language, but rather he lacks access to himself. It positions him as someone who isn't just socially anxious, but disconnected from his own sense of self. The quiet, withdrawn Raj we see so often isn't necessarily who he is, but who he becomes when he feels exposed. And when alcohol enters the picture, it causes him to become social and confident, but at a cost. The Rajesh he is now letting out into the world isn't the real Rajesh, it's an inebriated version of himself, which ultimately leads to more problems, including in his friendships and relationships, which leads to a lower sense of self-worth. Raj forms a dependence, and alcohol isn't the only thing he relies on. Raj depends on fantasy, make-believe, the virtual world, imagining perfect relationships before they exist. Also, he depends on validation, constantly needing reassurance from others. He is dependent on his family for money, and he's dependent on Howard to be his voice. It all points to the same thing. Raj is not able to rely on himself, and so he devalues himself, and this devaluation ultimately leads to him relying on himself even less. It's a vicious cycle. For a lot of the show, Raj is the person who never quite grows up. He's financially supported by his parents well into adulthood. Socially, he leans heavily on Howard, and over time this creates something deeper than the aforementioned dependence. It creates learned helplessness, because when everything is provided for you, stability, money, you never really learn how to generate those things for yourself. What makes this more striking is that Raj, on paper, has everything. He's wealthy, highly educated, successful in his career, and based on audience reaction, he's also quite attractive. And yet, he feels completely powerless, because external success doesn't automatically translate into internal stability. So instead he borrows power from the people around him, especially Howard, as I've mentioned. This is often toxic and unhealthy, and in many instances Howard contributes to the deterioration of Raj's self-worth even further. But let's be somewhat fair to Howard. He isn't always a negative force, and there are times when he does allow Raj to grow in a healthy way. Not to mention, out of everyone in Raj's life, Howard has been there, unerringly, and in his own way, I believe he cares about Raj. Ultimately, he wants him to be happy, but because Howard has his own maturity issues, he doesn't normally go about this in the right way, and so their dynamic is unbalanced. Howard tends to diminish him, and he controls the social dynamic, and speaks on his behalf, and Raj just accepts it, because before he gains a fuller understanding of himself, it's easier for him to be the lesser half of something than to stand alone and define himself, before he has the confidence to do so. He doesn't ask, "Who am I?" He asks, "Who am I to you?" No one in The Big Bang Theory wants love more than Raj, but what he's really chasing isn't a person, it's relief. Relief from loneliness, from uncertainty, and to an extent from himself. He falls in love quickly, builds fantasy versions of women, projects meaning onto relationships that haven't had time to exist, and when those relationships become real, complicated, imperfect, and human, he struggles, because reality can't compete with the fantasy. And underneath all of this is something more uncomfortable. Raj doesn't just fear rejection, he fears being fully seen, which is interestingly something Penny struggles with, as I mentioned on a previous video. But this struggle is quite different with Raj, because if someone truly knows him, without the performance, without the fantasy, they might confirm his worst suspicion, that there's nothing solid underneath. So he sabotages, not because he doesn't want love, but because real love would require him to be known, which for most of the series, he isn't quite ready for. Raj is almost always there, in the room, in the group, in the conversation, but very often he feels like an extra in his own life, the third wheel of so many relationships. He's rarely alone, but for me he always feels lonely. and that loneliness is amplified by comparison. Leonard has increasing stability as the story goes on. Howard finds some form of growth and maturity, even if it's slow, and even Sheldon, in his own way, finds connection. He finds Amy, who ends up being pretty perfect for him, and Raj watches all of it. each comparison reinforcing the same idea that everyone else is moving forward and he is not.
Do you have any idea what it's like to be the only one without a girlfriend?
Part of this comes down to how Raj sees himself as a man. He doesn't fit the traditional mold, which is too frequently pointed out to him by all of those around him. He represents an alternative and underappreciated form of masculinity. He's sensitive and romantic and emotionally open, and instead of embracing that, he feels ashamed of it. There's pressure from his family and friends, as well as the cultural expectations around him. Subtle jokes and judgments all reinforce the idea that who he is isn't quite right, so he internalizes it. And when you combine that with his mutism, his literal inability to express himself, it creates something quite powerful symbolically. Raj doesn't just struggle to speak to women, he struggles to express himself, and because he can't fully express who he is, he doesn't entirely know who he is. This, combined with the fact that Raj feels like an extra, ultimately lowers his self-esteem. But Raj does change. It's uneven and slow, but still meaningful, and it's one of the reasons I can appreciate the later seasons, even if they're not my favourite. One of the most important aspects of this comes in his job at the planetarium, which begins in Season 11, Episode 10, because for the first time we see him do something different. He speaks confidently, publicly, without alcohol, without a crutch, to a room full of people, and it's hard not to see the symbolism in that. The man who couldn't speak in anxiety-inducing situations now has a voice that people come to listen to and even enjoy. And I think this represents something well beyond professional growth. It represents identity, not a new identity either, but an identity that was waiting to come out of him all along. And alongside that, something else shifts. He starts to rely less on Howard. He makes more independent decisions, pushes back more, and begins slowly to define himself on his own terms. It's not a complete transformation, but it's incontrovertible, and it's pretty powerful in my opinion. And then we get to the ending, which for a lot of people is frustrating because Raj doesn't get the same resolution as the others. No clear happily ever after, no perfect relationship. He ends the series alone, at least romantically. And that feels unfair because out of all the characters we want that moment for him. We want the payoff. But if you look a little closer, something important has changed. You see at the end, Raj walks away from a relationship that isn't right for him. Earlier in the series, he wouldn't have been able to do that. He would have held on, out of fear, out of desperation. But here, he lets go, which suggests something subtle but significant. He no longer sees love as something he has to accept at any cost. If you will, he's no longer grocery shopping when he's hungry, which I'm told you should never do. He's still alone, but for the first time, he is able to be alone. And that's growth, because being alone isn't the same as being lonely, as I mentioned earlier. And Raj finally is starting to understand the difference. So while the show doesn't give him a perfect ending, which still bothers me occasionally, it does give him all the tools he needs to go and find a perfect ending. And honestly, I like to think that the very next day, Raj meets someone who's actually right for him, someone with whom he can share in a healthy relationship, not because he needs them, but because he's finally ready. Raj is easy to overlook. He doesn't have the clearest arc, and as I said, he doesn't get the most satisfying ending. Worst of all, a lot of his struggles are played for laughs, but that is exactly why he matters, because Raj represents a kind of struggle that doesn't resolve neatly. I think he might be one of the most recognizable characters, because a lot of people know what it feels like to rely on others more than they'd like to, and to struggle with their own self-confidence. Many of us know what it feels like to be the extra in our own story, and though we constantly strive for a better understanding of ourselves, there are days where we don't quite know who we are without someone else present. So in a way, I think for a lot of people, Raj is a reflection of who we are, or maybe a part of who we are. I don't know, but I know I'm grateful to have grown up watching his struggles. I am grateful to have witnessed a character who confuses being liked with being valued, who searches for identity in other people, who waits to feel ready instead of choosing to act. Raj learns to walk away from something that isn't right. He begins to stand on his own a little more. He becomes someone who can be alone, without feeling like he's disappearing. And that kind of growth doesn't look dramatic, but it's relatable, because most people don't get a clean ending. Most people don't suddenly become whole. They just get a little better at being themselves. And that's why Raj matters, not because he becomes the best version of himself, but because we go through the struggle with him, and in many ways we discover more from the struggle than the resolution. I just want to say thanks for watching. It's been a real privilege to be able to talk out loud about these various characters and actually have people listen and comment and discuss with me. It's been 2 or 3 weeks since I started this channel, and I think viewers are starting to understand what this channel is about. and so am I. It's about reflection and analysis, but I think what I'm trying to do is deal with the psychological and the emotional while remaining positive. This was my 4th video on the Big Bang Theory, and in the future I plan to continue this Big Bang series but also look at other shows, including sitcoms and just a bit of everything really, but always with the same style. So if you're interested, subscribe for more deep dives, commentary and analyses. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, it really helps. And let me know in the comments who you'd like a video on next.